Hi, everyone. Welcome to First and North, where we dig deep into the NFC North, keep you up to date on all the happenings in the division and around the NFL. Yes, even after the Super Bowl during the offseason. Joining me on this week's edition of First and North, the voice of the Lions, Dan Miller. From Fox Milwaukee, Tim Van Voren. And from Fox Minneapolis, Ahmad Hicks. First Sunday without football, boys. Ahmad, how did you hold up?
Had to watch a lot of Paw Patrol, a lot of kid movies, and whatever the lady wanted to watch. So we're struggling already.
Dan, it must have felt good to have the weekend off.
Yeah, I mean, you know what? It always takes me a couple of weeks of that abrupt ending, whether it's a regular season or the playoffs, where you wake up on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you think, oh, I got to go. And you don't have to go. There's just not as many places to be. We all still have jobs. We all still have work to do. But that incredible pace that you're on during football season comes to a close. And after a couple weeks, I get used to it. And I'll tell you, it's been somewhat productive. There was a woman at my house who apparently is my wife. And we kind of get along. So it's worked out okay. We've had some fun. I had no idea she was there for a while.
Hey, Tim, at least you guys have some good college basketball at Wisconsin and Marquette, right?
You bet, absolutely. Headed to Madison for one tonight. Got to Marquette last week, got to UW Milwaukee, so we're catching up on that. And stunningly, was able to watch late night NASCAR with rain delays that you guys know very well on a Sunday with the schedule.
That was awful. All right, guys, Jets officially released Aaron Rodgers after 2 seasons. Here's my question. Is the future Hall of Famer, is his career over with? Dan, what do you think?
It's really what he wants to do, because I do think if he presented himself properly to a couple of teams that might need a quarterback, I don't know, Pittsburgh, could he make it there? And then there's a couple other places around the league that may say, all right, let's give this guy a year, maybe 2 years, and see what he can do. But it comes down to, what does he want to do and how does he want to do it? Because part of what the Jets said at the end was, if we were to think about having you back, there's not going to be McAfee show where you're going to be making news every Tuesday, and then we got to deal with the fallout on Wednesday. And I think he's got to make a decision about how he wants to move forward as a football player. And then the Aaron Rodgers, who, you know what? More power to him. He can do whatever he wants, say whatever he wants, stand for whatever he wants. But when that comes back on the team and you have to kind of deal with the fallout every Wednesday, I think that becomes problematic. So I think there's some decisions he has to make in addition to some teams. But for a team that has an immediate need, it's something that I would at least look at.
You know, let me throw this out there, guys, because I don't know if you saw it. ESPN's Courtney Cronin floated the idea that the Bears should bring in Rodgers as a backup, saying his next role is to bring along the next generation. And we all know that Caleb Williams is a huge fan of Aaron Rodgers. Now, listen, I have tremendous respect for Courtney Cronin. I don't think she does a good job covering the Bears. I think she does a great job, amongst the best in this market nationally. And while I appreciate her idea, her support of such a move, or at least throwing it out there, let me tell you what I think. I believe there's zero chance of it happening in this town, nor would I be a fan of it happening. Number one, Aaron Rodgers, his ego won't allow for him to be a backup. Number two, I believe he's having a tough time, as you just said, Dan. He's having a tough enough time committing to the job right now as a 41-year-old starter in New York who needed to bounce back from injury. I don't think he'd have any interest in showing up on time for training camp and doing everything this guy needs to do with the rest of his teammates. Number three, why should this guy commit to being a backup? I know he didn't have a great season last year, maybe not even a good season, but there are a number of teams, as Dan Miller just said, who wouldn't mind having a starting quarterback who's committed, who threw 28 touchdowns and 11 interceptions for a bad Jets team last season, who, by the way, has the experience of winning what? 1, 2, 3, 4 MVPs in a Super Bowl. Number four, This guy made, I don't know, $35 million last season. I don't even remember what the number was. I know it wasn't $1 million. I'm not paying my backup anywhere near that. And finally, with a new offensive wizard in this town, a new coaching philosophy being instilled by Ben Johnson, a new era, hopefully, for the Chicago Bears, a new beginning for this franchise, why in the world would I want to make my franchise quarterback, Caleb Williams, always worry about the boogeyman behind him? Should he hold on to the football too long, like he did in his rookie season, maybe take another bad sack? Should he become more comfortable, God forbid, grip it and rip it more often this season, which is what we want from this guy? Absolutely not. I do not want Aaron Rodgers over his shoulder. Tim, you know Aaron Rodgers better than all of us. The guy wouldn't do it for Jordan Love. Would he do it for Caleb Williams?
No. He's not going to be a backup quarterback willingly anywhere, Lou. He could end up in this NFC North division. Guess what? Dan, you're not covering him. Lou, you're not covering him. I'm not covering him again in Green Bay. Ahmad, you'd have the only chance, I think. He's not going to be a backup quarterback somewhere. And I've heard it put, it's a game of musical chairs in the NFL, and there probably are more chairs than guys. And that's why Aaron Rodgers is going to get consideration if he decides to keep playing football. And there are going to be coaches or general managers who view him as a better win-now alternative than somebody else. And if you're looking to save your job or you're close to maybe getting into the playoffs, Aaron Rodgers is a far better bet, even at the age of 41, than a lot of other candidates out there.
Couldn't agree more with you.
There are a lot of other teams that are going to say, we don't want the distractions. We don't want the extra stuff that has come with Aaron Rodgers the last couple of years. And you can understand that case too. But the numbers would indicate here that Aaron Rodgers is more than competent as an NFL quarterback at this stage of his career. I believe he will play in the NFL next season.
All right, Ahmad, let me bring you in because the franchise tag window opened up today. Seems more likely that the Vikings are going to let Sam Darnold walk for nothing, avoid spending $41 million on a franchise tag. So I got a two-part question for you. Number one, letting Darnold go. Is that the right move? And number two, if it indeed does happen, is there room for Aaron Rodgers on the Vikings roster?
All right, I think I can answer both of those questions with one answer. You can't spend a ton of money on the quarterback if you can't protect the quarterback. And I think we saw in the playoffs last season, the Vikings had a really tough time slowing down the Rams' pass rush. And that's what it all boils down to. If the Vikings want to be successful, not only this season, but seasons moving forward, they have to get a good interior offensive line. So whether that's Sam Darnold in the backfield or that's Aaron Rodgers or J.J. McCarthy, they have to be confident in the guys up front. So I think that's first things first. Sam Darnold, do I think they'll spend a lot of money on him? Probably not. I think we've all seen Sam Darnold, come in here, do what he was supposed to do. He's going to get a chance to test out that free agency market. Aaron Rodgers, I know the plot keeps thickening. All the fans keep talking about it. The writing is on the wall. The Vikings need a quarterback. He needs a home. But I just think he carries a lot of baggage with him. Yes, like Tim said, he is a productive football player. He's still good and better than most quarterbacks in the National Football League. But when you look at this team, how they're built, how they play for one another, their egos are all kind of pushed to the side. And I think with Aaron Rodgers, you're going to get a lot of, antics around him and, his Pat McAfee show appearances and things that he wants to do. And it says a lot of I and me, pick me type of, personalities. And I don't think the Vikings have a ton of those personalities in their locker room. So I don't know if that would be a great culture fit for this team. But obviously, if you plug him in and you think about J.J. McCarthy, obviously your team may be better with Aaron Rodgers. But I just think from a culture standpoint, I think they avoid Aaron Rodgers right now.
Should they franchise tag Byron Murphy Jr.?
I think so. I think cornerback is one of those positions where they absolutely need that player for Brian Flores and his scheme to survive. And if they don't franchise tag Byron Murphy, you have no cornerbacks on your team right now other than Mekhi Blackman, who's coming off a torn ACL, and Dwight McGlothern, who was a rookie this past season, who only played in a handful of games. Byron Murphy turned down a contract extension from the Vikings because it wasn't the number that he wanted. He bet on himself, and then he came out and he was one of the tops in the league in interceptions and whatnot. You see 81 tackles, 14 passes defended, so he certainly lived up to those lofty expectations that he placed on himself, and I think he deserves a franchise tag or at least a new deal where he's paid what he wants to be paid.
Tim, I know Jair Alexander is under contract for the upcoming season, but I'm hearing reports that maybe his return to the Packers is unlikely. What are you hearing? What do you think is the right move?
I think unlikely approaches it. I think it's even stronger than that he's not back with the Green Bay Packers just because of availability issues as much as anything else. He has played less than half of the snaps since kind of signing his contract extension. It's just hard to keep going forward with that. If you lose Jair Alexander in the Green Bay Packers, that's a gaping hole in your secondary. There's no other way around that. They don't really have capable guys at this point on the roster to step into that type of role. They have to acknowledge that. But in Green Bay, they preach availability and have for years. And Jair Alexander just has not been available enough to justify that contract. I would not think he's back in Green Bay next year.
All right, guys, another top option for the franchise tag Chiefs guard Trey Smith. He's expected to be the top offensive lineman in the NFL available. ESPN's Adam Schefter pointing out that the Chiefs most likely place the transition tag on Trey Smith, which for those that are unfamiliar means that the transition tag pays the average of the top 10 salaries at the guard position instead of the top 5 if they were to franchise him. Also allows the player to negotiate with other teams out there who can match the Chiefs offer. Franchise tag, Smith makes $25 million. Transition tag, he earns a little over $22 million. Either way, Smith becomes the highest paid Bears interior lineman for the upcoming season. I'm hoping, guys. Hey, Dan, Lions finalized their coaching staff. I saw that you had the chance to sit down with both new coordinators, John Morton and Kelvin Shepard. What did you learn from each of them?
You know, Shep, we know. He's been here as a linebackers coach, and he's somebody that has had a presence with the media, and you know exactly what you're getting when you sit down with him. Just an infectious fire that pours out of him. The players love him. Aaron Glenn empowered him to work not just with the linebackers, but with the entire defense at times, put him in front of the defense to speak. So I think that's a big key, that everybody on that defense knows his voice. Everybody on that defense knows what the expectations are. And I think that Kelvin Shepard is going to have a very smooth transition from linebackers coach to now being defensive coordinator. Now, look, you got to call the game. You've got a bigger hand in designing the game plan. And those are things that we'll have to wait and see. But from a leadership standpoint, I think it's a smooth transition. John Morton is a really interesting case, new offensive coordinator. Obviously, and he'll be the first to tell you this, big shoes to fill when you're stepping in for Ben Johnson, who did some great things here in Detroit. But here's the key. When that opening came up, some people thought that there were some incumbents that might get the job, but there was the familiarity that Dan Campbell had with John Morton. They've worked together twice, including here in Detroit in 2022. John Morton has worked with Jared Goff. He was in the quarterback room when he was there. That's one thing that he made clear when we talked. So you've taken so many of the unknowns out of it. Oftentimes, when you bring in a coordinator from somewhere else, you're not sure what you're getting. You think you know from a couple of meetings and maybe talking to people, but this is a guy who's been in Detroit before, and on top of that, he's a Michigan guy. He knows what it is to be a Lions fan. He knows what this organization's all about. I think, again, it's going to be a smooth transition for him. Key there being, he's got a relationship with Jared Goff. Strength of the offense for years has been the relationship between Ben Johnson and Jared Goff. I think that thing moves forward with the coordinator and the quarterback collaborating to get this offense together. And I think that Morton has a real good chance to succeed. But let's face it, guys, a head coach in Chicago did a great job here running this offense for the Lions for several years. So they got to try to keep this thing going with a new man in charge.
Yeah, the Morton story about him going back home, back with the Lions, I think that's a great, great story. All right, now the offseason, scouting combine, a couple of weeks away, free agency looming as well. We will discuss each team's dream scenario when we come back right here on First and North.
Dr. Larson has no recollection of the last 8 years.
Doc is TV's best new medical drama.
I need to know.
And you can watch it anytime.
I will be a doctor again.
Doc, all new Tuesdays on Fox, and watch anytime on Hulu.
Welcome back. Lou Canellis with you here on First and North. Den Miller joins us from Fox in Detroit. Tim Van Voren at Fox Milwaukee. Ahmad Hicks, Fox Minneapolis. Yesterday, Pro Football Focus released a real interesting article about each team's offseason dream scenarios, the perfect free agent, and ideal first-round draft pick for each team. Here in Chicago, I've been preaching this, just preached it in the last segment, all about the Bears rebuilding that offensive line. Here's what the article listed for the Bears: signing the Chiefs guard Trey Smith. We just discussed Trey Smith. top offensive lineman in the market. Let's see if the Chiefs place the tag on him. Most likely the transition tag, according to ESPN's Adam Schefter. That will allow him less money, but also the opportunity to negotiate with other teams. And then the Bears double down in the trenches. I love this guy. Maybe his arms aren't long enough yet to play tackle, but LSU's Will Campbell's a beast at guard, in my opinion, even in the NFL. Fox NFL insider Jay Glazer sat down with CHGO, the podcast here in town, and said this is what he appreciates most from new head coach Ben Johnson.
But here's what I like about Ben Johnson. No one's talking about. As great as he was with Jared Goff, which he did a great job with Goff, but what he did, that offensive line, right? That offensive line was fantastic, and I think that is probably the most underrated thing that people don't think about of what he's been able to do with that offensive line and the different pieces there, and he develops.
Take me inside the Lions' last couple of seasons, last 3 years. How responsible?
No doubt.
How responsible for the success of Detroit's offensive line does Ben Johnson deserve? Because you guys had some monsters up front.
Everything. And I don't mean to take anything away from Goff or Gibbs or anything like that, but everybody on this team would tell you this team starts with that offensive line. It is built around it. They've got number 1 draft picks up there, first-round pick in Sewell, first-round pick at left tackle, first round, and Taylor Decker, first-round pick at center, and Frank Ragnow. They've paid those guys with extensions. Free agent in Zeitler last year. Glasgow's a guy that came back. This team has invested in that offensive line, and I anticipate Ben Johnson will take a page from what he did here in Detroit and try to make that happen in Chicago. It is everything to be able to protect your quarterback and everything to be able to run the football. Ben Johnson knows that as well as anybody. It's like Ahmad talked about, if you can't protect your quarterback, you got massive problems. So look, what he did here in Detroit was build an offense around an offensive line. A lot of dudes on that offense that can make plays, but the offensive line is the one that allowed it all to happen. He will work to make that happen in Chicago. I guarantee it.
They need it. Tim, let's talk Green Bay. Packers may lose center Josh Myers this offseason with Jair Alexander's injury history. Pro Football Focus has Green Bay signing Falcons center Drew Dahlman and drafting Ole Miss corner Trey Amos. If the Packers did that, what would be your reaction?
I'd be surprised that you're going to spend a lot of money on a center from some other team. If you want to spend a lot of money on a center, you could re-sign Josh Myers, who the Packers still like very much. The idea in Green Bay is if they let Myers go, they have other bodies on the offensive line, including last year's first-round draft choice, Jordan Morgan. Somebody will slide to center, and they'll keep going that way. I do think they'll fortify the offensive line. I'd be surprised if they go out and spend a lot of money on a free agent elsewhere to play that position. It's still an outside chance they could re-sign Myers, to be honest with you. As for drafting a defensive back, we talked in the last segment, Green Bay does need help at cornerback, assuming Jair Alexander departs. Amos would be as good a candidate as anybody for that spot.
Ahmad, take me inside the Vikings. I mean, massive roster overhaul with all the free agents hitting the market. If I'm not mistaken, we've discussed this, 25 free agents, and especially in that secondary. Pro Football Focus has the Vikes taking the top available safeties in both free agency and in the draft. What do you think? Dolphins, Javon Holland, and Georgia's Malachi Starks?
So I don't know if I agree with that Pro Football Focus article because, look, Javon Holland is a great safety. So is Malachi Starks. But I think Cam Bynum is a great safety. So is Josh Metellus. And I think there's also a path where Harrison Smith comes back to the Minnesota Vikings. I think they just need to focus on that interior offensive line because we saw in the previous 2 seasons, the Vikings just put a Band-Aid over their problem. And they got ripped off in the playoffs. And they couldn't protect Sam Darnold. And you're talking about inserting J.J. McCarthy there. Look, I know defense wins championships and defenses are important, but I think if you want to be a good playoff football team, you have to draft someone on the interior defensive line and interior offensive line. And the Vikings haven't done that defensively in quite a few years, so it's time for them to do that and stay away from the defensive backs.
Yeah, everyone needs help on their offensive line, it seems like. Dan, let me bring you in. We've discussed Detroit trading for Myles Garrett. We talked about it long and hard last week and pairing him with Aiden Hutchinson. Let me throw a name out at you. How about former Bear Khalil Mack?
It's an interesting case, and I think a lot of it would depend on what the price tag for Mack is. He still showed some ability to get after the passer this season, and I think if you had a situation where you had both him and Zadarius Smith, who is under contract for another year, it might be interesting. Last year, they spotted Zadarius Smith. They tried to utilize him in a way that he'd stayed fresh during games. You could do the same with Mack. You could use all three of them, move one guy inside if you wanted to do it. He's a guy's name's kind of floated around here because they are going to need to add something in terms of a rush end to help out Aiden Hutchinson, to spell Zadarius Smith, and maybe be able to have a little flexibility moving guys inside and outside. So I wouldn't say that's completely out of the question, assuming that end-of-career Khalil Mack has a price tag that you can swallow. You know, drafting a cornerback is interesting for the Lions. They drafted corners in the first 2 rounds last year, so I don't know if I'm buying that, but they are maybe going to lose Carlton Davis, so there might be an opening there. But I do know they like Ennis Rakestraw, their second-round pick from last year, who didn't play a lot this past season because of injuries and trying to get back on the roster after he got knocked out for a while. So I think cornerback may be in play a little bit in that tail end of the draft when they'll pick at 28th. I think defensive line probably figures more prominently into that, and maybe even offensive line because they got some decisions to make on the interior.
Just tell me if you like. Notre Dame, Benjamin Morrison?
Yeah, here's the thing on Morrison is I think a lot of it's going to come down with the medicals and how teams feel about him. He showed that he's got the ability to cover, and he showed he's got the ability to play at 6 foot, 190 pounds and come up and hit you. But he had a hip injury last year, and he missed basically half the season. So where's he at? When will he be able to go full strength? I think teams have to make themselves comfortable with that. That's a big question to have to answer if you're going to utilize a first-round draft pick on somebody. I think the position, maybe. I think the player. There's a lot of questions that I think you have to figure out as to whether or not you're comfortable in drafting him. The Lions have drafted some injured players and signed some injured players, and the results have been mixed. So I think they might be a little tentative. All
right, Dan, we need to take our final time out. NFL Combine next week in Indy. We'll have a preview next.
Stroopstork is known for cheese, laundry, and bowling.
You gotta be kidding me.
Going Dutch, all new Thursdays on Fox.
All right, let's bring back the guys. NFL Scouting Combine kicks off next week, Lucas Oil Field in Indianapolis. I'll start with you, Tim. What are the Packers looking for?
I think they're looking for defensive backs, as we talked about, reinforce that offensive line. Is a wide receiver in play because they've had injuries, and maybe we'll lose Romeo Doubs because of a couple of straight concussions. So every year, though, guys, with the Packers, whoever they pick, they say, I didn't really talk to the Packers at the Combine. It's always a surprise.
Still the youngest roster out there, man. Ahmad, Vikings only 4 picks in the upcoming draft. How are they going to attack it?
Look, I sound like a broken record, but I think it has to be offensive line, defensive line, then maybe sprinkle in a defensive back with one of those 5th-round picks. But I think they have to address their areas, their concerns up front. If not, you're just going to be the same old Vikings teams unable to win in the playoffs.
Hey, Dan, man, I'll tell you what, Detroit's philosophy, with or without Ben Johnson, draft and develop. Who are they looking at in Indy?
They've been doing it. Yeah, I think if you're looking at this, defense has to be the priority in my mind. Offensive line, maybe. But let's see if one of these defensive players can jump off the board with a freakish workout time, something like that. They'll be looking at that.
3 picks in the top 45 for the Bears. Offensive line, offensive line, offensive line. Guys, great job. We'll see you next week here on First and North.